Hello everybody, John Fenn here, supernaturalhousechurch.org with yet another teaching about the supernatural process of discipleship. Today I'm asking the question, what if they won't apologize? What if they don't apologize? How can we be at peace with people who won't apologize? They've done something, but they won't acknowledge it. And this has to do with some of the other teaching I've done with sins, trespasses, etc. So we're going to get into it. I'm going to answer that question, but first I need to lay a little bit of a foundation. The understanding throughout the Bible is that there are sins and trespasses, sin divided into two categories. Paul said in Ephesians 2:1, "You were made alive who were once dead in trespasses and sins." Now, the word trespass is horizontal. A trespass is a sin against another person. A trespass literally is like you've got a marked boundary and someone trespasses on that property or on that land. A trespass is a sin against another individual. A sin, however, can be vertical. And so that's why Paul said in Ephesians 2:1, you were dead in your trespasses and sins, making the distinction. A sin is just between you and the Lord. That's your walk with the Lord. That is your salvation. That is how you are in fellowship with Him. And you can sin just sitting at home, by yourself. I mean, look at the things that the Lord outlaws, so to speak, in the Ten Commandments, not making any idols, not taking His name in vain, etc. And, you can make an idol of anything that you put between you and the Lord. And so that could be a sin. That's something you can do individually, just between you and the Lord, but a trespass is horizontal. And it's very important to understand the difference because a lot of translations don't catch the subtle difference used, but Jesus is always very specific, as are the writers of the New Testament. And I'm still getting to the question of what do I do if they won't apologize? But in James 5:16, James writes, and he says this, confess your trespasses one to another. Now, some versions will say fault, like the King James Version, say confess your faults to one another. But that's not like, hey, I'm a messy person, I drop my clothes as soon as I walk through the door, that's my fault, sorry about that. That's not what James is talking about. He uses the word trespass in the Greek. And so literally it says, confess your trespasses one to another and pray for one another that you may be healed. See, that is part of both the decision to forgive and then the emotional healing. The first context is that trespass, because a trespass is always one-to-one, or no more than not like a group. A trespass is always generally one-on-one to the context of it. So confess your trespasses one to another, pray for one another so that your relationship can be healed. That's what he was talking about. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. So the idea is that somebody's been praying for the reconciliation of that relationship. It's also understood in Mark chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, where Jesus said, as you stand praying, forgive, which I've covered in a previous live session, is a decision, not an emotion. As you stand praying, forgive if you have something against somebody, because if you don't forgive those who trespass against you, neither will your Father forgive you your trespasses. Now, that's not sin. I've heard pastors, I've heard people use that to say, oh, if you don't forgive, you're going straight to hell and everything else. Jesus is very specific with his words, and he says trespasses. And sin is vertical, but a trespass is horizontal. So it's talking about binding and loosing here on earth and loosed in heaven. In other words, if you forgive someone's trespasses against you, you are loosing the Lord in your own life and loosing them to the Lord as well. It's just like the Lord's Prayer, remember, out of Luke chapter 11. Father, you're in heaven, your name is holy. You give us this day our daily bread. You forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We do it as. In other words, there's a reciprocation there. So Mark 11, 25 and 26 has nothing to do with salvation. It has to do with everything with the horizontal nature of trespass. You say, okay, well, John, how do I know that? You're saying that, but my pastor says, if you don't forgive, and I know logically it's completely ridiculous to think that everybody who's ever lived from Adam to whatever who believes in the Lord, says their last breath with nothing but warm and fuzzy feelings and rainbows and unicorns and butterflies dancing around in their minds. That's absolutely ridiculous. So how do you know what I'm saying is right about trespasses, that Jesus wasn't talking salvation there in Mark 11, 25 and 26, but rather your relationships? Well, it's backed up by what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 1 through 15, where he's talking to the Corinthians and he says, I wanted to feed you guys with some strong spiritual meat, but you weren't able to, so I had to give you milk. Even now I have to give you spiritual milk. Why? Because there's envy, strife, and divisions among you. Somebody says, I adhere to Paul's teachings and I listen to Apollos. He says, you're walking like you're not even born again. says, what can I do with that? You guys are nothing. I can't give you anything but milk with that. And this is where he goes on. Paul goes on and he says this. He says, I planted, Apollos as water, but God is the one who gives the increase. God is the one who gets the glory. Now he goes on and says, there's no other foundation that can be laid than the foundation of Jesus Christ in each of our lives. But everyone has to be careful how they build upon that foundation. And he tells them, he says, your envy, strife, and divisions, you're building wood, hay, and stubble onto the foundation of Jesus Christ when you should be building gold, silver, precious stones. And he goes on to say through verse 15, 13 through 15, he says, if you die with this wood, hay, and stubble, the day will declare it. The secrets of your hearts will be revealed, and that wood, hay, and stubble is going to be burned away. And he says in verse 15, he says, you will be saved, but that stuff will be burned away, and it will be as if you've come through a fire. So that confirms what he's talking about, that envy, strife, and divisions, that unforgiveness, that bitterness, that choosing sides, the little groups that you want to, be part of. That confirms that what Jesus was saying was he wasn't dealing with heaven and hell. He was just dealing with trespasses. And folks, we don't want to carry wood, hay, and stubble into our meeting with the Lord at our last breath. You want to be building gold, silver, precious stones like patience, goodness, meekness, self-control, godliness, agape love, brotherly love, etc. So what do you do though? What do you do if you're there in Corinth and you've got these people with wood, hay, and stubble? They're envy, strife, divisions. They're picking sides and they're backbiting and they're doing the church thing. And what do you do? Well, Paul deals with this in Galatians chapter 6, and this is the crux of what I'm sharing this morning. In Galatians chapter 6, he again uses the word trespass. If you have a brother who's overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual humbly restore him, considering yourself lest you also be tempted. In other words, what Paul is saying, some versions will say overtaken in a fault or overtaken in a sin, but it's actually the Greek word trespass. And so he says, if someone is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, that means the victim. You're not the trespasser, you are the trespassee. You've been trespassed against. You're the hurt one here. And he says, you who are spiritual, restore him in a spirit of meekness, considering yourself lest you also be tempted. And he says in verse 3, in that way you're fulfilling the law of Christ, you're bearing one another's burdens. But what do you do if they don't apologize? What if you go to be reconciled and they don't want to be reconciled? Well, he goes on in the very next verse and he says, however, if somebody thinks that he's something when he's nothing, he's self-deceived. What he's talking about is that person who hardens their heart and says, I didn't do anything wrong. And all they do is justify. You're left there apologizing, and all they do is justify what they did with no thought of apologizing to you or making it right. Paul says, however, if somebody thinks that he's something when he's actually nothing, he is self-deceived. But let him go. He says, God, it goes on down in the next verse, he says, God is not mocked. Don't be deceived. God's not mocked. He will render to every person whatever they sow, that's what they're going to reap. And so what he says right there, if they're not going to be reconciled, then let the Lord handle them. Let the Lord handle them. They are self-deceived. They are not a doer of the word, or else they would humbly also apologize and acknowledge their part in the wrongdoing. They would own up to their responsibility. But he goes on to say, he says, they're self-deceived. He says, but don't worry, God is not mocked. In other words, their issue is with God, not you at that point. At the point where they come, where they say, when they should do what's right and they refuse to do it, their issue is no longer with you because you've done everything you can do. You've done what you know to do to be right. At that point, their issue is really with God and their own heart. They have to deal with that. That becomes the vertical issue. You've done what you can do on the horizontal, and only faced a rebuff or a rebuke or just a hard heart. Now it's up to God to deal with them in their heart. And so that's why Paul concludes in Galatians chapter 6, the first 6 verses there. He says, don't be weary in well-doing. He says, for those that sow to the flesh, they will reap to the flesh. And those that sow to the Spirit will reap life everlasting. The burden is upon us to do what is right. The burden is upon us to pray for one another. And if somebody won't own up to what their responsibility is, then all we can do is pray for them and say, you know what? God's not mocked. He's the one who's dealing with it. Their issue at this point is no longer with me. Their issue is with the Lord and the wrestling in their own heart. So we'll let it go at that. I'm going to go on next week and talk about some things as well. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, walking the extra mile, what that means, some practical living skills to understand that we're not doormats, nor are we weak, noodle-spined, people, but right is right and wrong is wrong. And if some people want to build wood, hay, and stubble on the foundation of Jesus, that's their business. In the end, they stand before him one-on-one. They're not going to stand before us one-on-one. So we're not the Holy Spirit, but you do what you know to do, what you can do, and the rest of it you leave up to the Lord. You take care of it on the horizontal and let him take care of the people on the vertical. All right, God bless. Talk to you later.